Thanks everyone for joining us today on another edition of SPE Live, which is now being brought to you by the SPE Foundation. Talking to us today about the direction of technology development in oil and gas technology is Barbara Berger, who's the head of Chevron Technology Ventures, one of the industry's oldest venture groups that invest in startups and a lot of the new technologies that you've been reading about over the years in JPT. As we talk to her, send us in your questions through the social media platform that you're using to watch us. We're going to save some time at the end. And with that, I want to welcome Barbara. Thank you for coming in today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, this is an extraordinary time in the industry. It's not just a crash, but we're also living through a pandemic. And so, the mantra of 5 years ago was lower for longer, and it feels like, it's back again. So as we think about the startup ecosystem and where a lot of new technologies come from, how are today's events going to shape the next few years to come?
Yeah, so great question. So first of all, hope that you and your family and all our audience are staying safe throughout all of this. When we think about the startup ecosystem, I think it's vibrant, it's needed, and they're trying to address really important problems. But for each startup, the story is a little bit different, just like for each company and for each individual. And so we have a portfolio of companies that we've amassed over, we've been in existence for 21 years. And, each company had to, first of all, assess their own situation, assess their employees, assess their operations, and then really understand the impact of COVID, of the market conditions on their business plan, and do some self-help, look to their investors for whether or not they're going to support them through that, and make the direction changing actions that they needed to. Most of our startups, this has not been a positive message. They've done a really good job, but most of them, COVID and market conditions have made it tougher. But that's not the case for all of them. There have been opportunities in all of this. And so, good opportunities come for startups, whether the market is tough or whether it's, you have tailwinds. So we're there to support them. And, when you say lower for longer, that's just one more challenge we've got. So we need innovation directed at how can you succeed in those market environments.
So obviously it's very tough for the startup world, but, for a VC, does this actually in a way make your job a little bit easier in terms of narrowing the scope on what you're willing to take risk on investing in? And if we look at this through specific lenses, can you speak to me about like the different buckets that compete for, your investment dollar, production technologies versus software?
Right. No, good question. So first of all, our first focus was on shoring up our current portfolio. And, I kind of went through the steps that those companies have. But we also have dry powder, as the industry would call it, for new investments. And there's a lot of opportunities out there. The problem set is maybe a little bit different. You talked about lower for longer. And so we're looking for technologies that, can lower cost, increase cycle time, lower emissions, all of those problem sets. I think a couple of things that have happened in this is, one is some valuations came down. So that's always good as an investor, particularly a new investor. Most investors are staying the course, but there are some that have flown. So that gives us opportunities. We're having to do due diligence and having to do, our early engagement with startups in a different way. We always want to go and see them, kind of see what's there, kick the tires, meet the team, and we're having to do that virtually. There's some positives to that in that you can get a lot more introductory meetings done and engage. And I think the velocity is increasing. But we're having to change some of our processes in terms of how to do that.
That's an interesting point. I was actually talking to a startup founder recently who said the same exact thing, in one of their early fundraising series, and saying that, we love to get intimate with potential investors, but we're actually able to finish the job a lot quicker of courting everybody because we're doing it remotely. Just as an aside, I'm curious, is that because the startup world and the VC world, it's a very close-knit community. Almost everybody knows each other, and you guys go to a lot of the same events together and see each other all the time. So is this distance, work from home, remote conferencing, is that something that might actually stick around in this ecosystem, or are you guys going to try to revert back to the mean and get face-to-face more often?
Well, I think it's an interesting one that's going to play out, right? And hopefully all of us are not thinking back to when is it going to get back to normal, but we're envisioning the new normal. So, I think some of it is we are adopting or developing practices that we will continue on. Even this kind of engagement, it's been a lot easier for me, the notion that I'm just going to be sitting in my study and do this rather than, carve out time to physically go to a place. Now, the disadvantage is I don't get to see the audience, so that's not good. But, I think the piece that, we've got all kinds of technologies for networking and stuff, and a lot of the organizations are trying interesting things so you can pop into a table and have a small intimate conversation and so forth. But I think we've got to figure out how to do physical events in the future sensibly and responsibly, and maybe even hybrid events. And I know there's a few trials and pilots that are going to be contemplated this fall here in Houston about, so how do we bring together the investors and the startups so that we can have some of that, but still, do it in a responsible way. I don't think we've all figured out how to do that yet. I was going to say, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that's a fair answer, considering, here at the SPE, we're going through, all of those same challenges ourselves. But, I wanted to also ask you about some of the themes that we've been seeing in the technology space over the last few years. And one of them is, big companies like Chevron trying to embrace external technologies and find, where they can fit in oil and gas. And the other circles back to startups and how in a B2B world, big clients need to help foster those small young companies and give them, not just the financial runway, but the actual practical experience to grow, and especially in such a risk-averse business. So, if you look back on just what we've seen since the last downturn, 2015 to now, what grade would you give the industry on being able to work those two fronts?
So am I giving a grade for effort or results?
Well, you tell me. Give me one for each. How we've done on external technology adoption, and how well has the business really fostered this startup ecosystem, and are there any shining examples of either?
Yeah, so good. So I would give us, I'm a tough grader, but I'd probably give us, an A- B+ on effort. I think the doors are opening. I think and in a time of change, I think companies look for, they become much more open in terms of what are the capabilities and what are the approaches to change. When times are good, that's actually when it's hardest to get new things adopted, right? So I think effort A- to B+. In terms of results, I think time will tell. So probably, it's more like a B- B with an upward arrow. I think the opportunity in Houston, and I don't know if how many of your audience is from Houston, but I think one of the things that Houston can distinguish itself relative to the startup ecosystem is this connection with the corporates. There's a very high concentration of corporates here, and corporates bring experience and understanding of the problems, experience and scale, and ultimately they bring their supplier dollars. And so if you can get the little guys and the big guys to work together, I think that really is a good recipe for success. I think the other thing is the small guys have gotten smart. Some of the small guys are not so small anymore, but they've gotten smart and they've hired people from the industry. So they have domain knowledge, they know what the problem sets are, and they get credibility into the corporations. I think that's one thing Silicon Valley has even gotten. I think they've read that playbook and they've hired people from our industry to be able to help better define the problems and thus the solutions, particularly in software innovation.
Yeah, that was early on. That was a huge, cause of divide. Was do you have domain expertise? Do you not? And it seems like over the years we have seen more companies, especially on the coast, hire talent from this business to sort of help make that translation easier. But let me ask you about another sort of age-old, VC startup operator problem, which is you can throw all the money you want at a new technology company, but if you can't get it to work in the Permian Basin, for instance, then it might die on the vine. And so how have you? What is your philosophy? What are the things you've learned about connecting what happens at HQ in the VC group to the wellhead?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And there's a little bit of our secret sauce there, but I'll tell you a bit about it. Because you're right, just investing in companies is a necessary part of it, but it's not sufficient. And, we learned that that we had to take it through to what we would call use. So we needed to collaborate with our business units and our functions to really ask the question, does the thing work? And will it add value to Chevron? Because it could work, but it doesn't really add any value because it doesn't either take costs away or produce more, or it's just one more layer that we put on of protection or control. And so, we've worked on that over time and have, a fair amount of success. It's still, it's not a slam dunk, but you have to do that. And also the startups need that feedback. So sure they want investment dollars, sure they want revenue, but they also want to know, does this thing work before I go and scale it up? And what kind of feedback do I get? So we kind of try to deliver the whole experience because that's ultimately what's going to have the biggest impact on Chevron.
How often, though, tell me, is it that your team falls in love with a technology or a startup, and then you try to take it to the field and vet it against who would be the end users, and they actually come back and surprise you and say, no, this won't work. Is that a regular occurrence, or how often does that happen?
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. So first of all, don't fall in love with the solution, fall in love with the problem. And we try to guard against that. And we try to guard against it even up front. You bring me a solution, I'm going to say, what's around it? What's the landscape? Who are their competitors? All that stuff. Sometimes we even do a bake-off where we might trial yours versus the incumbent or yours versus the other folks that are there, just, because we want to pick the winner. Innovation, people think it's all about technology. It's about people. It's about your willingness to try new things. We've got a number of different practices to try to collaborate. It is about collaboration. We've had some success in the organization across all the streams. And so we've got some credibility that when we bring something to you that, we think it's going to work and we're willing to work with you on a trial, that says something in the business. We also hire from our businesses. So we hire people that have experience in a refinery, out on a platform, in the oil field. And again, that's all building up the broader team that looks at these technologies.
If we're sticking to sort of these interesting startup and VC themes, one of the ones that I enjoy debating with people the most, or talking about the most with people, is buy versus build. And this really centers around software investments and how big operators look at software solutions. And you know, I know that there's a lot of sort of it depends on trying to answer this question, but how do you reconcile the buy versus build conundrum?
Yeah, so, and I think buy versus build sounds so binary, and it's actually, as we go along, there's more and more different pieces. You know, it does depend, but you told me you weren't going to accept that as an answer. You know, the reality is it something where we can have a competitive advantage, or is it something where the pace of innovation externally is going to be so much faster? And I think we're evolving as a company, and our comfort level in working with, whether it be a startup or, you know, one of the big tech companies, in terms of, you know, where is going to be our competitive advantage? Is it the development, or is it the application? So I do think it does depend, and it's ever evolving. And if you looked at our portfolio, you would see things from startups, you would see things from our tech partners, you would see things from the oil field service partners, and you would see things that we have developed ourselves. So it's I think that's the answer, is to look at each area and be able to have the facility to succeed with all those different tools.
You know, sometimes I wonder if we're even asking the right questions all the time. And as I hear you talk about buy versus build, it's really, you know, I think it goes back to something you said, you know, fall in love with the problem. And so I wanted to get to a question that came in from the audience that was along those lines. And it was, you know, here it goes. Which kind of challenges are you looking at for startups to solve? So as specific as you can be, you know, what are the innovations that you're looking at for oil and gas?
So a couple of things, you know, on the subsurface, it's obviously being able to know more about the reservoir and your drilling operations, and it's, you know, it's better data, cheaper, and more reliable. On the surface, a lot of it is around asset integrity. Again, there's a lot of digital plays relative to the surface as well. But let me also talk about, and this cuts across into the energy transition, which we have been investing in companies that play in this space for quite some time. But in 2018, we launched a future energy fund to really concentrate in this area. And so it's, you know, how do you use less energy? So it's energy efficiency technologies. It's when you do produce CO2, how do you, you know, either capture it and store it, or capture it and use it? How do you ensure that methane emissions are reduced? They're detected, reduced, or mitigated. So those are all things within oil and gas that are part of the equation. Obviously, it's production, it's cost. You're talking about lower for longer, so we got to do that. It's reliability, but it's also a low carbon footprint.
You know, since you brought it up, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into your future energy fund. So this launched 2 years ago. It's $100 million. Can you talk about, you know, any of the investments you've made so far? And with regards to those buckets that you just outlined, you know, are you looking, how much more are you looking at carbon sequestration and reuse versus emissions mitigation?
Yeah, so the Future Energy Fund, initial $100 million, and we've made, I think, 9 investments so far, and they run the gamut in really 2 large buckets to start with. One is lowering the emissions of oil and gas, and I talked about that area, and the other is low carbon value chain. So we know that the energy mix is going to be more diverse as we go forward. And by 2040, most estimates are 50% of total primary energy demand is going to be oil and gas. That means 50% is not. And the system is going to be an integration of all of that. So we also are placing bets in non-oil and gas. I think in that area are a few things that I'll talk about. One is just different sources of generation. Clean heat is a problem. That, if your innovators out there want to think about it, hydrocarbons are used in a lot of heating applications. So what can you do to lower the emissions in thermal processes? Carbon capture, use and storage. We focus mainly on the capture. It's a very costly part of this of the process. But utilization. So rather than just storing CO2 in the ground, what can you use it for? Sort of the circular economy. Hydrogen. So can you either make hydrogen cheaper or lower the emissions? Then there's this whole area around mobility, because transportation and oil are so much tied together. But as mobility goes, where's the innovation there? And then the power value chain is getting more decentralized. It's using different sources. And there's a huge part of software integration there. So we've got investments in all of those. Some of them have a direct linkage currently into Chevron's operations. And so we're working on, trialing and so forth. And some have no linkage with the current, but we see them as important in the energy system of the future. And we want to make sure we understand what it takes to be successful, and make sure Chevron is positioned to be able to capitalize on them.
Well, it looks like the question sounds like we had a little reverb there, but excuse me. It sounds like the questions that are coming in. It's clear to me that there's a lot of people, from the startup world that are listening in, and so I wanted to be sure to get to some of their pretty specific questions. And this sort of gets to the persona of Chevron Technology Ventures. And, the question is, if you're looking at a seed round, series A, B, C, so these are obviously stages of fundraising and maturity. Where's the sweet spot for Chevron? Where do you guys like to come in on the startup invest in?
Yeah, no, a good question. So our sweet spot for investments typically is an A and B, and that's where we feel like we can influence and where you need support. We do have a pre-series A milestone-based grant tool that we use when we see something that's not series A, but we'd like to get a little closer to it, get a little closer to the technology, but also the people. So A and B, and obviously as the company matures and grows, then we go along with them if we still see a good positive trajectory for the company.
And I have another one that's coming from the startup point of view here. What are the best practices that you would recommend to startup companies who are dying to get their first field test? So they've done everything except for get into a well or get access to production data.
Yeah.
What are some of those things that will help them cross that chasm?
Yeah. So it's a really good question, and a lot of times a startup doesn't know where to go in a company. And that's one of the reasons that we have developed the capability within Tech Ventures, so that when we're looking at you, we're not just looking at you as a company and are you investable and what's the circle of co-investors around you, but also, so how might this go, get into Chevron? So, some of it is getting introduced to the team members that I have, whether it's in a local event or we're going to need to do some things virtually. And we get comfortable with the company, we get comfortable with what you've got, we understand the problem you're working on. And then, if we see something we like, then, we do all the landscape work, we understand the problem set, we think it solves a problem that Chevron has prioritized, then we would work with the startup and with the business unit and other experts in the company to, in fact, design the trial. We can't help you if we don't set it up that way.
Let me ask you another general question about a big topic, digital transformation. And this is sort of, I'm going to ask you for sort of like a grade here, but what phase, what inning are we in as an industry? and where are we seeing the most impact? So, we speak so often in generalities about this topic. I'd really love, like, what segment of the upstream business is being most impacted positively by digital investments?
So I think across all of the major functions in upstream and even in downstream. But what I would say is that we're probably in the early innings from, a number of the things that we've actually gone through to implementation have been more transactional, which is, I think that's where you start. And I think the transformational capabilities are being identified. But it's not, it's not overnight that you can actually implement them at scale. But I think that's the next inning. And then you just start to see, the rewards for all of what you've done. Because the digital capabilities aren't just so you can do the current workflow cheaper and faster. It's that you get new workflows. And those are transformational by definition. They're very disruptive. And so they take some time because they do cut across functions at that point.
How do current circumstances influence the speed of the trajectory? When we talk about making digital investments, like actually putting cash on the table, and as well as adopting these things into our workflows and processes. We're facing an industry that's contracting again. Sadly. Lots of jobs are being lost, lots of people in the field and in HQ. So what does that do to this drive towards digital?
Yeah, it's a tough year, and I feel it as a leader of an organization. I feel it as an investor. I feel it a bit as an employee. It's not an easy time. I think that the progress or the pace depends. When one of your audience members asked about getting things downhole. So trials and hardware trials and things like that have gotten harder in the short term. Things that can provide a very clear picture of the benefits and things that are more sophomore oriented and stuff, I think those have maintained their pace. Maybe some of them have been accelerated. The big transformational ones, we as a company and as an industry, we're going to be very focused because you can't take them all on in a time when when the market conditions are tough. So, I think we're having to prioritize more, which means that by definition, some folks don't make the list.
Barbara, I probably got time for one or two more questions with you. But this is one that I wanted to throw at you from sort of my personal experience. I sat through a lot of Shark Tank events and a lot of gatherings of startups. And it's been evident to me in my reporting and from what I've seen is that there's been, in addition to sort of a heavy interest in software, there's also been a lot of investment interest in onshore, specifically North American shale technologies versus, say, a deep water oriented technology. As the market is now in a little bit of flux, to put it lightly, do you think that the investment community at large will change the scales there of how much interest goes to onshore technologies versus something that's a little bit more smaller scale but possibly higher impact in deep water? And tell me if you disagree with my judgment, in the first place.
I think that, and hopefully this will be a general answer that'll scratch that itch. I think you got to look at the investor pool and say who's going to be investing in that in those technologies. They typically are corporates. Strategic investors have had a fairly high percentage of the investment, and how many of them are going to invest in core oil and gas versus the energy transition versus digital? And I think the dollars are getting diluted a little bit, and so there's we continue to invest across all of that, but even some of our peer companies are not investing in oil and gas innovation other than digital. And so that does put, it puts some stress on hardware innovation and the number of investors that are really looking at that. I didn't do the onshore, but it's a bigger theme of, who are the investors and, what is the role of the corporates and what is the role of the oil field service going forward? Because very early on in those companies' lives, they need support from the industry or investment in the industry, and I think it's getting diluted a bit.
Well, while I have you, I'm gonna get you on one last question because I think it's a really, really good question. And geographically, countries or continent, where do you see the innovation concentration? So, has it changed? Are things coming from, the Houston area more or less often? Are you going overseas to look at technologies? How has that shifted?
So, a plug for Houston is they're increasing here because, we didn't have a lot in our portfolio here, but, we will invest from almost anywhere. And we had a lot of concentration in Norway and, the UK and Scotland. I think we're seeing more from the continent, from Israel, all over the US. And actually that is, I think, a trend that I think it's good, is that we're seeing innovation not just from the two coasts, but in the center and in lots of places in the center. As an investor and as a user of innovation, the more the merrier, right? So it's a volume game for us, but we'll take that challenge.
Well, Barbara, I really thank you for sharing your insights and letting us, get sort of an insider's view on what happens at CTV. And we wish you the best of luck. And to everybody listening, we thank you for joining in and sending your questions. But we are sadly out of time for this discussion. We want you to join us on social media in the coming weeks. Look for other interviews that we're going to be doing with SPE Live. And we want to thank again the SPE Foundation for sponsoring this platform. So with that, Barbara, I thank you once again, and I will bid you farewell.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.